New life. This is Pastor Richard Martin, your pastor for the past 5 years. And as our time together is coming to a transition point, I realize that I do not have enough sermons, prayer meetings, power hours left to share all that I would love to share with you. So I just want to share a few conversations with you. A number of thoughts that have been on my mind for the next few days. Just a brief moment of your day and time to be able to connect. And today, I want to talk about grief. 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 Have you experienced grief lately? I know that I have, and perhaps that's where we are connecting right now. We are all experiencing a stage of grief as we are on the verge of transition. For the past 5 years, we have shared a pastor and pastor's family and people relationship. The concerns, the cares, the celebrations and sorrows, the triumphs and trials, not only in our church, but in our community, in our commonwealth, and even in our nation, yea, even the world, has allowed us to ride the ebb and flow of life together. And of course, we know how pastoral relationships go, at least in our denomination, that a transition will come one day. But I have to tell you, New Life, I don't sense that you, and I know that I have not, allowed that to loom large over our heads as we have made this journey together. So in some way, we are experiencing the grief that happens right when a transition is upon you. I know that in our church over the last several days, we have experienced grief as a result of the loss of those who are loved ones. And not just the loss of those who have passed away that we love, but also the grief of not knowing always what to say for those who are still living, for the brothers and sisters, the sons and daughters, the nieces, nephews, the children, the grandchildren. Not knowing what to say or how to respond, that can cause us to feel grief. And then when we look at violence and wars and tragedies taking place around this nation, even though it's just a headline, it's a weighty headline. The news reports, the online internet articles, the vlogs, the op-eds, these things cause us to feel grief. You know, I read a quote once by Jamie Anderson, and it says that grief is really just love. It's all the love you want to give but cannot. All that unspent love gathers up in the corners of your eyes, the lump in your throat, and in that hollow part of your chest. Grief is just love with no place to go. If grief is a form of love that really doesn't have an identifiable recipient or destination, then I want to take this time to let you know, New Life, that I love you. I speak for myself as a person, as a full human being who has had the privilege to serve as your pastor. But I also speak for my wife, with whom together makes up our immediate family. We have parents and siblings and extended family members, no doubt, but it's been Kyla and me, and it's been you and us. And we want to say that we love you. And it's on the foundation of this love that we believe that grief stems. It's not a bad thing, it's actually a good thing. Grief, then, if it is love unspent, gives us the opportunity to spend our time expressing our love while we have that opportunity to do so. And as we've said several times, I know that I have lost count. I know that you've not been counting. You are already loved, and we feel loved too. Now, there's someone who is listening right now, and you may be saying to yourself, Pastor Martin, what do we do with this unspent love called grief? As the days are descending, there's going to come that point where the transition that was most recently announced will come to pass. Not just now in terms of my transition from the church as your pastor, but also there'll come a time when that loved one will be buried. There'll come a time where the house will be sold. That moment will come where you will say goodbye or see you later to the son or daughter as you send them off to college. There'll come a time where you'll retire from that job that you've invested so much time, passion, and energy into. What do we do with the stuff of grief? Well, first, feel your grief. Feel your grief. For a variety of reasons, too many to mention in the next several moments, we can often run away from feeling our grief. At times, it's because grief doesn't always feel comfortable or because we've not always been taught how to feel it. And all of us feel grief differently. Sometimes it's disappointment. Sometimes it's indifference. Sometimes it's sadness. Sometimes it's anger. And I want you to know that as you go and as you learn, I want you to feel the grief. Give yourself permission to become acquainted with how grief is expressing itself in terms of your feelings. You might not always have words, but sometimes it's okay if you can use related words. Sometimes I've learned that you can express your grief by correlating it to a certain color. We probably know one of those as blue. Thus, I'm singing the blues. That's a form of grief. There's a reason why we've seen people described as being red hot mad. Probably correlated to fire or something of a color that images how you're feeling. Green, feeling new, feeling like this is an uncharted part of a season of life. Sometimes you'll have to use colors to describe how you're feeling. Whatever you use, feel your grief. But then there's another thing I want you to do, and that is share your grief. If there's anything that I've learned about the grieving experience, is that it tempts you to grow in isolation. And whereas there are some moments where you mature and develop through your grief experience by yourself, I want you to know that there is no substitute for sharing your grief. It doesn't have to be with the masses. It could only be with one person. Recently, I had the chance to share in grief with a friend of mine who sadly lost his father. It had just happened that same day, and he actually called me. And maybe you're like me, maybe you're not, but if you are, you don't always have the words to say, and that's okay. You really want to be there for that person and bear their burdens with them. And I could tell, as we were connecting over the phone, that all he really needed was to share that moment with someone else. Perhaps you're that person who needs to share your grief, or maybe you're the person with whom someone else will share theirs. Just know that the grief you feel can also be shared. And then finally, grow your grief. Grow your grief? Yes, grow your grief. Do you mean grow through your grief? Well, that's partly the question that I'm answering with all three of these. Feel it, share it, and yes, grow through it. But I want you to hear the language. Grow your grief. In other words, let the grief you feel mature. Let it progress. Now, that may sound like I'm saying let your anger lead to you becoming angrier, or let your sadness become a deeper sadness. No, here's the image that I'll share to illustrate what I mean when I say grow your grief. It's the image of a person who is running long distances, and when they begin training, they can only run 1 mile. And at the end of that 1 mile, their lungs are burning, their quadriceps and hamstrings are tight, the lactic acid has built up, and they feel like they'll never be able to go further than that mile. Because the feeling at that point is so intense. But the more they train, the more they grow, not avoiding those feelings, but able to go further before they feel those feelings, and even able to go further while carrying those feelings with them. Do you see the image? That means that you don't stop loving that individual. It doesn't mean that you cease to care or cherish the memories that have been made. It doesn't mean that conversations won't happen between us after June 11th. It simply means that we will grow the grief. We'll be able to go further. We'll become stronger. We'll become better, and we'll become wiser because we learned to feel the grief, to share the grief, and to grow the grief. What do you think about that? Can you apply any one of these principles to your life and your grief experience today? Well, why don't we make the effort together? Let's feel it, share it, and grow it to the glory of God, and we'll get better by and by. I'll talk to you soon.